So today we're going to discuss early childhood. We're going to take a slightly different tack on this one. So we're going to discuss early childhood really through the lens of practicality because we've been reading about development and such in your textbook. So you're getting a good bit of that covered. So what we're going to do today is we're going to focus on what are some aspects of their development that you would work with? How would some aspects of their development impact how you would treat them or how you would interact with them? So really, what would be the effects, right? That from what we've learned, what would be the effects of us interacting with them? As you guys know, that this is my area of specialization, working with children and adolescents. And early childhood is an especially sensitive and especially important, and especially special time of life. So again, we're going to cover from that area. We're going to talk about some of the pre-verbal aspects of early childhood, the developing verbal aspects of early childhood. So I hope you enjoy this as we approach it from a slightly different angle this week. Okay. So, just a little bit about video games. This has been brought up before, right? This has been talked about before, but just kind of coming up again because it's having a more and more profound effect upon early childhood as children are starting younger and younger and younger to use more and more tech. According to the Mayo Clinic, children who spend more time in front of a screen can develop a whole array of problems: irregular sleep patterns, behavioral problems, impaired academic performance. One study of the University of California found that the more screen time children got, the harder it is for them to recognize emotions. Other studies have found that the overuse of technology can impair a child's development or ability to self-regulate. So again, we can see that research is starting to come out that's showing that there are a lot of effects of video game and tech use. Internet gaming disorder is in the appendix of the DSM-5, which is the current Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Disorders that's being used for diagnoses, clinical diagnoses in the country. But it's been recognized as one that needs further research. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the next DSM-6, Internet gaming disorder is an officially recognized disorder. Then there are these two little things for you guys, and I'll give you these clips in the Blackboard. Okay, so a controversial topic to talk about is the impact of divorce on children. We are going to talk about this anyway. One of the reasons it's not talked about a lot is people are very afraid of making parents who are divorced feel poorly. And for a long time, honestly, I was afraid of bringing it up for exactly that reason. However, what I've really realized is that I think we're spending so much of our energy wanting to protect parents from feeling bad about the choices they've made that the people who are being affected most are then the children who feel like they can't mourn the loss of their parents, because that's really what it is. It's really the death. It experiences a death to children when their parents divorce, and so there's a lot of kids who they have a lot of guilt, a lot of anxiety, a lot of confusion, a lot of trauma and trauma-like symptoms from their parents getting divorced, and it's not really being talked about because everybody's afraid of making the parents feel bad. So if you are divorced and you have kids, this is for informational purposes. This is not for the purposes of making anybody feel bad. This is for the purposes of having us all be educated about the true effect of divorce on children. Absolutely, there are some children that are affected worse than what we're going to discuss, and there are some children that are affected less. Unfortunately, most parents believe that their children are not affected very much at all by the divorce, and what we're finding is that that's not the case. Generally speaking, most children are quite affected. A lot of them feel like they can't show their parents, or sometimes they're not even consciously aware of where some of their symptoms and behaviors come from. And again, because it's not being discussed as something that's sad or bad, it's just normal, they should just accept it. A lot of children don't find out and learn about some of these things until they themselves become adults. Okay, so children from divorced homes suffer academically. They experience high levels of behavioral problems, grades suffer, they're less likely to graduate from high school. So this was a sociological review called the Family Structure, Parental Practices, and High School Completion, and the link to this research is at the end of this PowerPoint. Kids whose parents divorced are substantially more likely to be incarcerated for committing a crime as a juvenile. And this is from the Center for Research on Child Wellbeing. It's called the Father Absence and Youth Incarceration Study. Children in divorced homes are almost 5 times more likely to live in poverty than are children with married parents. Again, not taking into account even the SES of the married parents. So it doesn't even really matter the starting SES of the married parents. Just the fact that the parents are divorced makes them 5 times more likely to grow up in poverty. And this is from Harvard University Press, a study growing up with a single parent. Teens from divorced homes are much more likely to engage in drugs and alcohol use as well as sexual intercourse than are those from intact families. And this is from the Journal of Marriage and Family Research, Family Structure as a Predictor of Initial Substance Use and Sexual Intercourse in Early Adolescence. Okay. So, as we can see, some of these effects that we're discussing are not just early childhood. A lot of them start in early childhood and then go into adolescence. We're going to be talking about it a little bit later on from the early childhood standpoint, but some of this research certainly covers both early childhood and adolescence. Children from divorced homes experience illness more frequently and recovered from sickness more slowly. So that's from social science medicine research. They're also more likely to suffer child abuse. That is from a Child Abuse and Neglect study, the Journal of Comparative Family Studies. Children of divorced parents suffer more frequently from symptoms of psychological distress. So that's again from the Child Development Research Journal. The emotional scars of divorce last into adulthood. That's from the Journal of Marriage and Family Research. Okay, so there's and this is just a smidge. This is absolutely just a teeny tiny little bit. There's a ton of research out there about the incredible negative effects of divorce on children. Everybody wants to think that it's better off, the children are better off if the parents are happy, but that's not the case except for extreme situations of abuse. So it is better for the parents to stay together. Again, unless there's extreme situations where there's physically in danger, or there's severe or real abuse going on. Those are certainly outlier situations. But divorce has a very negative impact, and the people that are most affected by the negative impact of divorce are, of course, the children who cannot do anything about it. And this is a YouTube video that I'll also give a link to you guys so you can hear a little bit of the perspective from a child of divorce. Okay, so the divorce rates peaked in the 1970s and the early 80s and have been declining for the last 3 decades. It's often talked about as being 50%, but that's actually not what it is anymore. Those who married in the 2000s are so far divorcing at even lower rates. Interestingly enough, if they cohabitated before they married, they have increased chances of being divorced. So living with the person you intend to marry is not a good way to prevent divorce down the way. If you do not want to get divorced, do not live with the person before you were married, statistically speaking. Again, everybody always wants to believe they're the exception to the statistics. If current trends continue, nearly 2/3 of marriages will never involve a divorce, according to data from University of Michigan economists. So again, if current trends continue, we're going to be looking at only 33% of marriages ending in divorce. People are starting to realize that there's a lot of other solutions besides divorce. Of college-educated people who married in the early 2000s, only about 11% divorced by their 7th anniversary, the last year for which data is available. So again, the more education you have, the less likely you are to get divorced. People who are less educated are more often the ones who get divorced. So again, you have 11% of those who were college-educated. Ultimately, a long view is likely to show that the rapid rise in divorce during the 1970s and early 80s was an anomaly. Again, it's still cited, the 50% divorce rate is still cited, but it's not current. That is not applicable to right now. It's also important to keep in mind that some of the inflation of the divorce rates is because one person has been divorced 3 times and another person hasn't been divorced at all. Right? So it may be talking about the marriage rate in general, but once you have one divorce, your chance of having 2 divorces increases, and then your chance of having 3 divorces increasing, and then so on and so forth. So you can tell that like one person having 6 divorces is going to drastically skew the rates, and 6 other couples who have not gotten divorced at all would be required to make it look like 50-50. So that makes it look like all marriages have a 50-50 chance in that little mini cosm of information I just gave you. But obviously that's not a really good picture of it, because there's one person who's gotten divorced 6 times and these other 6 couples have never gotten divorced. Okay, so when we're working, we're going to go back to that practical application, right? Thinking about divorce and how it impacts children, and thinking about tech. Kind of keeping those 2 things in mind, because those are 2 things that I see come up pretty frequently in early childhood when we're working with people in early childhood. And again, we can think of like how it affects the brain, right? So tech would affect. It talked about emotional development. It talked about social engagement, and then divorce, right? Divorce is the heart of who a kid is, because that is the family. The family disintegrating in early childhood is often devastating to the identity of self-worth that children are forming at that age. So, two main rules that we're going to think about when we think about working with people in early development, in early childhood: clear expectations and consistent consequences. You will hear me say this quite a few times in this lecture, and it's a good thing to know, hint hint, for working with people in their early childhood stage, having clear expectations and consistent consequences. So, clear expectations. One of the difficulties with divorce is, of course, the children did have clear expectations. They had clear expectation of their family staying together, and that is hurt a great deal. Consistent consequences, as I'm sure you all know, divorce often has very inconsistent consequences, and it leads to the child having a very inconsistent life. Even if the parents try very hard to be on the same page, which is honestly pretty unusual. A lot of them will act like they're on the same page when they're with each other, but then separately they'll be vying for the kid's affection or something like that. The child doesn't usually have consistent consequences. Because they're not in the same household, the effects of that the parents are making on the children are not immediately known by everybody present in the household. That can't be discussed. There's a lot of communication that's cut out. So one of the best ways, if you're working with somebody in early childhood, and maybe they have been exposed to a lot of tech, maybe their parents are divorced. So a really good ground rules for you and how you interact with them are to always give them clear expectations and consistent consequences. And some people look at this and they go, oh, that's about punishment. No, it's really not about punishment. Like, I guess part of this would be potentially punishment, but really it's about how you interact with them. Clear expectations means you let them know, within reason. You don't need to, write a 500-page paper on, what exactly your trip to the zoo is going to look like, but you give them clear expectations of what your trip to the zoo will look like and what you might not be able to do. You let them know what the day at the park is going to look like. If as much information as you can give them. You let them know what you expect from their behavior. Yeah, you let them know what is unacceptable from behavior. You try to be clear with them so that there's not a whole bunch of confusion, a whole bunch of I don't really know what to do, which can increase anxiety and other things. You try to be clear. Consistent consequences. It's very important to be consistent with what you do. So this is really up to you a lot of times and what you want consequences to be. So again, consequences are both good and negative. A lot of times we look at the word consequence, we go, that's bad, that means punishment, but it doesn't really mean punishment, right? Consequences of working hard is getting a paycheck, right? So consequences can oftentimes be very good too. One of the things you want to do with children, especially in the early childhood stage, is to give them very consistent consequences. If they do something that they know they shouldn't do, they know what will happen to them if they do it. If they do something that they should do, they go above and beyond to do something, they know what'll happen if they do. Okay, so when I work with early childhood children in the early childhood stage, one of the things I keep in mind is the three-part person. Okay, so my background is in philosophy, for those of you who don't know. So I look at this kind of a little bit like the tripartite soul. So we have the affective part, the feeling part, the cognitive part, which thinks, and the conative part. And the conative part is the doing part, and doing comes from the feeling plus the thinking. So I try to really think about these three parts of the child. Now, again, absolutely, this is true of adults as well. But I find it just especially helpful in looking at children. And so that's what we're talking about today. So that's where we're going. So again, affective. How are they feeling? Are they aware of their feelings? Do they have words for their feelings? Are they expressing their feelings in healthy ways, unhealthy ways? Explore that. Cognitive. What are their thoughts? A lot of times this gets left out in therapy, which I think is very unfortunate. And a lot of times in our culture, we use the word feeling and thinking kind of interchangeably, which of course is not very good, and it doesn't allow for great clarification. So someone would say, I feel like you're my best friend and you'll never leave me. But that's not a feeling, that's a thought. The feeling might be a feeling of warmth, right? The feeling might be a feeling of security. But you're my best friend and you're never going to leave me, that's a thought. But sometimes we'll say I feel like when we actually mean I think. So then I explore the inner world of their thoughts. There's a lot of different ways to do that with children. We're going to talk a little bit about this as well, because I don't do a lot of verbal work, which is the way that, primarily when people are after thoughts and feelings, what they want to do is they want to talk about it. And so I don't do that, because especially with young children, the world of verbal is not going to be a super great world for them. They're not going to be able to navigate it super easily. So instead what I do is I skip to conative, which is doing. So we spend a lot of time doing, which encompasses feeling and thinking. Now this doesn't mean we don't talk about feelings or thought. It doesn't mean that. What it means is what we focus is on the doing aspect, which is more suited for someone in the early childhood stage, and that accesses both the feeling and thinking part. So just some interesting quotes I thought you guys might like. So Freud, it's clear that in their play, children repeat everything that has made a great impression on them in real life, and that in doing so, they abreact the strength of the impression and make themselves master of the situation. Right? And we can see this in some of the cases that are discussed by Dr. Perry. The spontaneous and self-generating activities of the child enable him to conceptualize, to structure, to bring to changeable levels of activity his experiences and the feelings with which he invests them. Play furnishes the child with opportunities to act out situations which are disturbing, conflicting, and confusing to him. So again, we have thoughts and feelings here, right? And play allows them to act this out. And then Cudson said play is intrinsically motivating, meaning you don't really usually have to force a kid to play. Sometimes when they are damaged by too much tech, they might have to rebuild the skills and the muscles, so to speak, of being able to play. But most of the time, play is intrinsically motivating. They will want to do that. They really want to explore. Okay, so some things to consider. Just thinking about words, right? Verbal and nonverbal, which I've been talking about. Various pressures are created by words and can be lessened and avoided with silence or minimal speaking. So again, this is especially useful in that early childhood stage where you as the adult who's working with them is going to be so much more comfortable and competent in the world of verbal than they are. And excuse me, I know a lot of you aren't interested in working with children. You're taking lifespan development or you're something, general psychology. These are things you're interested in, but not from the standpoint of wanting to actually treat or work with children. But what I'm hoping this gives you is, okay, so all the research that we've done into early childhood, what does that mean? What do we do with it? And this is a practical way we can do with it. So we know that because they're less verbal and their brains are less developed in that way, we know that they might perceive some of the verbal development that people in stages beyond early childhood have developed. They might see that as intimidating. And getting the interpretation of what they meant and the intention of what they meant can also be things that are difficult. Sometimes there can be a felt need or demand to talk. If a question is asked, they feel like they have to answer. Asking questions oftentimes implies that there's one right answer and one wrong answer, right? They can get it wrong. And then, of course, that goes back to the right-wrong factor. They might be afraid that everything they say can be right or wrong. And again, they're the kid. The person working with them is an adult. They might default to always be the one who's wrong. So this is extremely simple, but I just wanted you guys to see the difference between the areas of the brain that are involved in a language task and a cognitive control task. And then the premotor cortex, the supplementary motor cortex, right? So these are all motor, right? So like moving, right, and doing things. So we can see that different parts of the brain are being accessed by moving versus thinking and talking, right? So moving, doing, and thinking and talking access different parts of the brain. Now, obviously, the brain in reality is not broken down so precisely that one part of the brain only does one thing. So I don't want you guys to walk away with that understanding of the brain. We're still figuring out the brain. We are nowhere close to understanding the brain. But we have the indications, right, that we have motor specialization in some parts of the brain, and then we have language and cognitive centers in other parts of the brain. And you can see there's not a great deal of overlap, right? So we're accessing different parts of the brain with those different activities. Okay, so this was a story that I wanted to share with you guys. This is actually a client work. And this was a work done by a client who was very intelligent, felt very safe in the world of nonverbal. So a lot of the work that we did together was not a lot of verbal, it was a lot of doing. This was one of the final pieces that he made, that he built. which to me really represented the fact that he was nearing the end of his treatment. Of course, not just this piece alone, all of the things in his life that he was doing and had worked through demonstrated as well. But this was a piece of it. And this is a chessboard, and he made this chessboard, and I won't give you all the backstory, but a little bit of the backstory was that his father, who had been a negative influence for most of his life, but whom, of course, he still loved, often used chess to kind of oppress and try to humiliate his young son, which, of course, shows and speaks to the father's insecurities. One of the last things the boy did was to make a chess set himself. Now, I had a chess set in my office. Like, if he had just wanted a chess set, I had one. But I think what was important for him and what he's demonstrating here is that he wanted to own, he wanted to be master of the chess set. It was his chess set as he designed it to be. And again, I think we get at that mastery component, right, of play that was talked about in one of those earlier quotes. So this is very descriptive, and I think this is a very good example of the early childhood stage. How some of the mastery that is needed to understand, own, and reduce confusion is not going to be super easily achieved through verbal, right, through the verbal lens that they're just starting to develop. But through nonverbal lenses, it can still be pretty clear, right? Because this is pretty clearly a chess set. Okay, so just some underpinnings of the medical kind of work we talked about. We're not going to go through all these, but just a couple that I especially focus on for this age group is that being present is and being available is very important for the early childhood stage. I think that's oftentimes something that is very misunderstood by parents and adults, is how important being present and being available is. It breaks my heart whenever I see kids and they just want to spend time with their parents, like at a park, and their parents are pushing them with one hand on a swing and checking their text messages with the other hand. And a lot of times I think parents think, oh, there's nothing else to do. I'll just look at there, no one cares. But all that attention that you're giving to your kid, when they turn around and they see you, or when you comment on their swinging, all those moments of attention that are given to them when you think it doesn't matter are some of the biggest and most powerful moments. I absolutely encourage parents, when you're out with your kids, do not look at your phone except for emergencies. And then you set your phone on maybe a loud ringtone if you're actually genuinely expecting an emergency or something like that. You set a loud ringtone and put it to the side. Because we trick ourselves that we think, oh, I'll just do this and it doesn't really matter. But those little times of looking away, those little times of your attention being disengaged, they have a hefty cost. They have a hefty cost, especially for young childhood, especially for early childhood in this age. So I would say when you're with the children, put your phone away as much as you can put it away. Not as much as is comfortable, because a lot of people are addicted to their cell phones. So not as much as is comfortable, but as much as you can. And frankly, for most of us, that's most of the time. So these are just some different ways to think about division of materials to help kids express themselves non-verbally. So you've got aggressive, nurturing, expressive, and real-life toys. And then you have this other different way of thinking about toys, which would be formless, moldable, and static. So formless would be things like crayons and finger paints, right? There's no form. The kid entirely gives the form to it. And then you've got moldable, which would be like, these Bendaroos or clays or Play-Doh or things like that. And then you have something that's static, where the purpose of it is not for the child to change it or mold it or shape it or anything like that, but them to play with the thing that is already, such as a play kitchen, puppets, right? So this is another story. So this would be a static, right? Because it's a puppet. So this would be a static one. This was about a very, very young child who had been taken away from his family by police officers. And he was very angry with the police officers. And he had my police officer puppet. And for several times when we would work together, he would come to my office. He'd take the police officer puppet. He'd run around and chase me. I would, have a puppet on my hand. He'd chase my puppet. And he wouldn't want to be friends with my puppet. He'd want to hit my puppet with his stick or with his hand. And then at the very end, the child would rip his police uniform coat off and throw them both on the ground. And he did this several times. 4, 5, 6 times. And then eventually, the police officer did not get his clothes taken off and get thrown to the ground. And he very, very gently over time became friends with the little puppet that I would wear. And they would actually, do things together. And that was a way of him working through the aggression and the anger that he felt about police officers. He didn't really have the words, the stage of development that he was at. He didn't have the words to really talk about his anger and his frustration with the police. But being able to choose this puppet, and again, I have a lot of puppets and I have a lot of other figurines in my office. He could have chosen many, many other ones, but very specifically went to the police officer. So this is a perfect way of showing how he was able to process non-verbally. So again, well suited to the developmental stage he was at. And here's another one. This is also from somebody. We can see again. There's so much about all these that I want to share, but for the purposes and length of this, I don't want to overload. But this was a young girl who was a child in a large family and had constant fears of being forgotten or neglected or there not being enough for her. She never said this. That wasn't anything she expressed verbally, but this is the very first sand tray that she ever made in my office. And the story that she gave to this was there was gold and treasure, and there were pioneers fighting over it, and then there were like woodsmen who wanted to fight over it, and there were Indians who wanted some of it, and everybody was fighting. And then one of them won. I don't remember which party won, but one of them won and killed all the others and then dumped the treasure into the sea. And that was her story. And her story was extremely similar. She told a very similar story multiple weeks in a row. I want to say it was about 6 weeks, using different elements. Like 1 week it was dinosaurs, and I mean it was different stories, but different characters, but it was always the same story. There was a little bit of treasure. Everybody wanted it. They fought. One party won. They killed everybody else, and then they dumped the treasure in the sea. That was the theme throughout all of these things. So again, this was a way of her non-verbally really demonstrating that there was a lot of competition over treasure. Once the treasure was even gotten, the party who won didn't know what to do with it. Right. Again, this wasn't stuff she was explaining verbally, but this was making it very clear what her problem and her tension in her family was. As she was doing these sand trays, interestingly enough, her father told me how quickly she was actually starting to work on some of her behaviors at her house. So she wasn't telling me with her words what was going on, but she was demonstrating with her sand trays what was going on, and she was processing what was going on through her play and taking mastery of it and becoming less confused by it. And that was really being demonstrated by her behaviors. This was the last sand tray she did, and you can see it's actually a pretty small period of time, right? 8/24 to 10/26, so we got about 2 months exactly. And this is one of the last sand trays. This is a sand tray that told me that she was pretty close to being done with treatment. Again, keep in mind, this is 2 months. This is very, very quick. And this was the story she said for this one is there was a race, and there's actually another one over here you can barely see. But there's 3 riders, and they were in a race, and there were 3 treasure chests, and they had all get a treasure chest at the end, first, second, and third. And then when they won their treasure chests, on the way home, they gave out the treasure to people as they went home. So you see how that's a very, very similar story to the others, but with a very different interpretation. Right now, instead of now there needing to be bloodshed and then the treasure being dumped uselessly into the ocean, there's still competition. But now it's organized competition, right? I even like how she has all the people cheering on the sidelines, right? And then she has like this majestic white horse kind of just looking on, and then there's a dog here looking on too. So there's still competition for a limited amount of treasure, but it's this positive atmosphere. It's this structured and controlled atmosphere. And then also everybody gets some. I don't know if you can see that, but there's 3 little treasure chests, different sizes up here, and they all have a little bit of treasure in them. And then once they all get some treasure, they're going to share it with everybody. So a very similar theme in a lot of ways, but a much different resolution. So again, this is a great way. She was non-verbally processing a lot. And we didn't have to talk about it a lot in words because she was demonstrating it a lot through doing. And again, her behaviors at home were becoming better and better, and she was becoming less and less confused and overwhelmed by how she was feeling, what she was anxious about in her home. She was able to work through things, not take things out violently on her brothers and sisters. Okay, so we're not going to talk about all this either because this would be more like something that clinicians themselves would be interested in. But just kind of to run it past you guys to see what you, just to kind of give you guys a heads up. Some things you want to consider would be how much muscle control is needed for this skill. Because you would want to take into consideration the physical condition, the anxiety level, the age, You might not want to start with a real sloppy kind of paint with a 3-year-old. That might just be too overwhelming for them, and it might not give you anything usable and meaningful. How messy is it, right? That kind of goes with that, because again, you need to consider like how you be okay with the mess, and how long would it take to clean up, and how messy might they get themselves, etc., etc. And then the last thing we're going to say is what attention span is required. Now, this is the big one, because the attention span changes actually a lot from the beginning of early childhood to the end of early childhood. The attention span can change quite a lot. So something that might be completely inappropriate for somebody at the beginning of early childhood might be great for somebody at the end of early childhood. So that's something that needs to be taken into consideration, absolutely, in the early childhood stage, but it's also something that changes a lot, and changes very quickly sometimes, too. Okay, so again, this is information that I don't know that a lot of you would specifically care about. So, because again, I know some of you are interested in becoming clinicians, but I know that a lot of you aren't. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this either. One thing I'm going to just point out is inviting them to choose a begin or join activity. Trying to put as few expectations on them as possible, and instead extend to them invitations. A tracking form is something that I often use. Again, this isn't relevant to a lot of you guys, so we won't spend too much time on this. But a tracking form helps you become aware of themes, changes, and something unusual that was demonstrated in their play. And then something that people are usually very interested in is, okay, well, kids play, and sometimes kids play bloody war, but does it always mean if a kid does something weird and strange and violent that they've got a problem? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Some, especially depending on, what TV their parents allow them to watch, or what TV their parents watch that, they watch anyway, or, what they're exposed to, or things like that. So that definitely needs to be taken into consideration. But generally some themes that have been researched are when something is empty, like when a kid will play and they'll build something, but it doesn't have anything in it. When something will be unpeopled, it'll have no people, or animals that are being utilized as people. Now, some kids really just love to play with dinosaurs or something. That in itself isn't, but how are they using the dinosaurs? If there are a lot of fences making things very closed off, if things are very rigid, like things that have to be just so, there's no freedom of movement, there's no freedom of placement, they're being very, very rigid with how they're doing everything, how they're building everything, how they're constructing everything, whatever it is. Disorganized and chaotic, if they just kind of throw things in there. I actually had a client do that one time. I've had a client do it a few times, but it's pretty rare. I had one client do it one time. She just grabbed as many things from the sand tray shelf as she could and threw them all into the sand tray. And I at first thought she was just, it was a behavioral problem. And I realized it wasn't a behavioral problem. She was actually just really that chaotic on the inside, and she was using the sand tray to demonstrate the chaos that she was feeling on the inside. And then aggressive. Again, this is something that needs to be really observed by the clinician, because aggression, you have somebody you have toy soldiers and they make a little scene of a war. That in itself is not necessarily aggression. Aggression would really be when it's a very bloody, violent, moving attack. So those would be things to investigate more. Again, they don't in themselves mean, oh, this kid is damaged, but what they are usually good indicators of is this should be explored more. Okay, so these are some things that I usually encourage clinicians to reflect over. But again, we're not going to go over them all. But one of the things, the only question that we're going to review here is how many questions did you ask, and did you want to ask more? Because something that you'll see often with people working with little kids is they will just bombard them with questions. And kids in the early childhood stage, I'm sure a lot of you who have kids in the early childhood stage or who have witnessed this instance, you'll see these children in the early childhood stage, and some professional will just, load them with questions, and the kid will just like deer in the headlights, like, So it's important to remember that we as adults may feel really comfortable with all those questions, but kids are just overwhelmed by it. They don't know how to respond. So typically with early childhood, fewer questions is actually better, significantly better. And then this is very general research, but I just thought it was interesting. So going by gender, And looking at diagnosis, thinking of, remember those, we talked about the formless, moldable, and static. So it has been found, and some research has indicated that for ADHD, moldable is more effective. Anxiety, moldable, followed closely by formless. PTSD, formless for females, has been identified as being more effective. Learning disorders, static for males, has been identified, and males primarily having that. Asperger's, moldable, again males, has been found to be primarily helpful. And ODD, there's been found to be no specific category that's more helpful for ODD, but it primarily takes place with men. In just completely in general, not taking into account diagnosis at all, generally females in this stage prefer formless, and males prefer moldable. Again, it's very general, just going by gender. And these are some of the references if you're interested in looking anything else up that was discussed.